Black women are supposed to bow their heads and cry. Why are you standing up? The patrol officer snarled as he pointed a gun directly at a black woman in the middle of a funeral. He shouted orders, pinned her to the ground among the wreaths. He needed no reason, just the fact that her skin was not white. But what he didn't know was that the woman he aimed at was a major general in the military, respected throughout the Pentagon. And this time, the law did not side with the badge, it sided with honor. When a uniform becomes a mask for fear, who will dare to speak the name of justice? What do you think? What state do you live in? That morning, Arlington National Cemetery was wrapped in a thin mist, like a white veil gently laid over a grief not yet dispersed. The national flag hung at half-staff, heavy in the early March breeze, and the air was so still that the sound of soldiers' boots stepping on dry grass felt like a blade slicing through the silence stretched taut. A row of black-covered chairs sat neatly aligned beneath the old oak canopy, where the family of the fallen soldier sat upright like flagpoles unwilling to break. Children wore miniature uniforms, adults adjusted medals, and every gaze fixed on the flag-draped casket at the center of the ceremonial zone. No one spoke. No one dared cough because this was a military funeral, a sacred event where all emotional displays were subdued to make room for the only thing permitted to remain: honor. A black SUV slid in from a side gate, the engine nearly silent. The rear door opened, polished leather shoes touched the ground, and the figure who stepped out prompted both guards nearby to salute reflexively, almost instinctively. She wore a uniform, adorned with the rank of general, pinned crisply on her left shoulder, an insignia only granted to those who had walked through more battlegrounds than the conscience. Elise Monroe brought no entourage, no noise, just herself, holding a small urn wrapped in black cloth, which would be placed beside the casket as the final token of a comrade she once commanded. Her face was cold, her eyes steady, but it was the silence in her walk that made everyone nearby rise to their feet, not out of fear, but because they knew they were witnessing something rare, a general coming to honor a soldier. Only one man did not stand. Robert Hasker, the officer in charge of security on the cemetery's west perimeter, stepped directly into the SUV's path, slapping his palm loudly onto the hood with enough force to rattle the front of the vehicle. The slap rang out harshly, jarringly out of place in the solemn service. One of the young soldiers holding the mourning flag nearby flinched, dropping the wooden pole to the ground with a dry crack. The whole area froze. A child in the front row, dressed in a miniature uniform, looked up and whispered to his mother, "Is that man yelling at her?" The mother bowed her head but didn't respond. Her fingers clenched tightly around her mourning cloth, as if holding her composure together by force. Elise stood still, unblinking, her gaze drifting slowly from Hasker's palm, still bearing the red mark from the slap, up to his eyes, cold and gray like unfinished concrete. She did not step back. Hasker didn't ask permission, nor seek approval. He stepped forward, blocking her path, eyes brimming with contempt. "I thought you were with the choir," he spat, eyeing her rank as if it were a cheap souvenir bought at a tourist stand. "Not a general." One of the two guards exchanged a glance with the other, but neither moved. Elise slowly opened a small leather wallet, retrieved her military ID, and held it up with textbook precision, saying nothing. Hasker didn't bother to take it. He merely glanced at it and said, loud enough for the entire row to hear, "They fake these things real well nowadays, especially the ones trying to prove something." A noise emerged from the seating, either clenched teeth or a stifled sob. No one could tell. Elise's expression didn't change. She lowered her arm, tucked the ID away, and took one step closer to the casket. Hasker raised his arm, blocking her, and hissed through gritted teeth, "You can't go through. This is a restricted ceremonial zone. You're not on the approved list." An older veteran seated behind, a former Army captain, tilted his head and murmured to his neighbor, "Are we burying a soldier or burying honor itself?" The whisper didn't travel far, but it struck a buried nerve in the hearts of all who heard. No one stepped in. No one dared come between Elise and Hasker, not because they agreed, but because they didn't know. If they stood up, would the system stand with them? The sky sank a shade grayer. A gust of wind swept across, causing the flag on the casket to flutter briefly before falling still, like kneeling in silence. Elise did not budge. Her black shoes stood less than a pace from Hasker's, and in her eyes there was no rage, only something colder than contempt, a silent refusal that needed no voice. Hasker flinched slightly, but didn't yield. "I have the right to ask," he said, "and you have no right to respond. Without authorization from command, you're not allowed here. And don't think those stars exempt you from inspection. We're here to protect honor." His final words were aimed at the ribbons and medals on Monroe's chest. There was no sign in his tone that he believed a single one. A soft sigh escaped from the left side of the burial site, vanishing almost instantly. The flag-bearer lifted his pole again. The child still looked toward Monroe, not understanding what was happening, only sensing that the woman was being pushed away from a place where she belonged. Elise turned to the casket. She didn't approach it, but she didn't retreat either. Her hand gripped the urn, wrapped in black cloth like someone holding tight to a memory that could not be allowed to break. That gaze did not ask for permission, nor require validation. She stood there like a living statue, in the middle of a funeral, cleaved by prejudice, by authority, and by the fear of those unwilling to see someone like her standing in a space they thought sacred only to themselves. And then, in that frozen moment when the entire memorial was suspended by the motion of a hand that had no business holding a gun, one truth became louder than any rank or command ever issued. This was not a battlefield. This was a funeral. And at that funeral, the one meant to be honored had been replaced by a meaningless display of dominance. Elise didn't need anyone to say her name, because her name, and the action she was about to not take, was already being recorded, not in ink, but in the shiver crawling down the spines of every witness. She remained standing, like a boundary that could not be pushed back. Her left hand held the urn of the fallen soldier. Her right hand withdrew the military ID that had just been dismissed. The midday sun shifted silently, casting light on the cold metal surface of the card, as if to remind onlookers that the letters engraved there came not from printed ink, but from blood, sweat, and years of service. Yet, in the face of Monroe's silence, Hasker saw defiance. He stepped forward half a pace and snatched the card from her hand with a sudden, crude motion so forceful that her jacket's hem trembled under the pull. His grip clenched tight around the card as he raised it above his head, letting sunlight flood its face. He flipped it back and forth, inspecting it like someone checking a counterfeit bill at the edge of a flea market, then suddenly spat directly onto the grass at her feet, not missing by an inch. The entire area froze again. The sound of boots from the ceremonial squad in the distance halted mid-step. Something had shifted. It was no longer suspicion. It had become an intention, deliberate and unapologetic. One of the young soldiers on the left flank, a white man barely past 20, hair cut sharp, medals still pristine, leaned forward, stepping half a foot as if about to speak, but the hand of his superior rested on his shoulder, squeezing gently as he whispered 4 short words. "Not the time yet." The young soldier froze, not from fear, but from comprehension. In the military, "not the time" wasn't a command. It was a warning that any action outside the script came with a price. And the one paying that price now was a general, standing before the invisible muzzle of a weapon called doubt. The ID card remained in Hasker's hand. He didn't return it. He simply held it at eye level, tilted it side to side, then sneered. "They make good fakes these days," he said, loud enough for the perimeter cameras to catch on mic. "Places like Baltimore, Chicago swarming with these. Looks real if you squint, but people who need to prove they matter always buy these things, especially when they can't earn their rank on merit." His tone wasn't loud. He didn't shout, but the way he pressed down the final consonants, like leather boots grinding into sand, made every word sound like a slow, ice-cold stab. Behind him, unnoticed in the bushes to the left of the ceremonial zone, where a group of journalism students had been observing with handheld cameras, a phone began live-streaming. The angle was perfect, capturing Hasker's face, his grip on the card, the urn in Monroe's hand, and the direct gaze she fixed on him. No one from the group stayed pressed. The weak 4G signal blurred the image, but within 4 minutes the live feed appeared on a military forum, under a blazing red caption. Cop interrogates a 4-star general, live during a funeral. Elise Monroe still said nothing. No rebuttal, no justification, no reaction. That precisely made the atmosphere feel even more haunted. She didn't need to raise her voice. She wasn't a woman who needed to shout to be heard. Instead, she stepped forward, face to face with Hasker, close enough for his breath to reach her collar. Her eyes, neither cold nor angry, carried a gaze that made the person opposite feel like they were standing in front of a mirror, forced to confront themselves stripped of rank, badges, and excuses. Her voice dropped, not out of weakness, but with the knowledge that what she was about to say didn't need volume to carry weight. "You're not doubting the card," Elise said slowly, each word honed like a blade. "You're doubting that someone like me has the right to carry it." No thunderclap followed, no dramatic cue, but the way her words echoed through the funeral, a space filled only with wind and the heartbeats of those holding their breath, turned every head, even among those who had previously looked away. Not because it was the first time they'd heard defiance, but because they'd never seen one this frigid, a resistance that made the accused stand still, as if being strangled by their sense of honor. Hasker's lips tightened. For the first time his face faltered slightly, not from shame, but because he didn't expect the blow to come in silence, from a layer of verbal ice no tantrum could shatter. But he didn't step back. He didn't know how. More importantly, he wasn't allowed to. To him, retreating in front of a black woman bearing a high rank meant admitting a truth he'd spent a lifetime denying, that the system no longer stood on his side. "You're quite the speaker," he hissed. "But according to protocol, an ID doesn't prove identity. The authority to verify belongs to me, and I haven't finished verifying." The words landed like a trap not to restrain a person, but to drag an entire sacred ritual down into the mud of personal malice. The crowd remained silent, but phones were being drawn, not to call anyone, but to record the moment when someone representing the law used his power to humiliate someone representing unconditional service. Monroe didn't flinch. She reached out to take back her card. Hasker didn't let go at once, holding it for half a second longer, like a thirsty man gripping his last drop of authority. But then she tightened her grip, pulled it back in one swift, commanding motion. It wasn't violent, but it was decisive. No one saw where her force came from, only that when the card landed in Monroe's hand, the sound of metal tapping her fingernail rang so sharply it seemed to cut the wind. She turned away, said nothing more, leaving Hasker standing in the aisle, hand empty, mouth ajar but speechless. And as he fumbled for his next excuse, a notification appeared on the young soldier's phone at the left flank. Live stream cop versus general. Over 120,000 watching now. No order was given, no slogan was shouted, but from the front row, the mother whose child wore the miniature uniform slowly rose to her feet, not to protest, but to step into the aisle and walk toward the casket. She didn't look at Hasker, she only looked at Monroe, and nodded, as if ending something that no longer needed explanation, as if beginning a new ritual in place of what should have been sacred. In that moment, no one dared say the funeral had been interrupted. Only those with discernment understood. The real burial had just begun, not for the soldier in the coffin, but for everything this country once called untouchable. Monroe stepped forward. Not rushed, not hesitant, just one step, grounded in the full weight of a person who had once crossed battle lines, had once walked through life and death without asking anyone's permission. Her polished black shoes touched the compacted soil in front of the casket, earth already cracked from heat, now exhaling under the weight of someone who did not belong to submission. Her hand still gripped the urn, steady, not a speck of ash shaken loose. Each breath she took marked a line. Each step closer was a question to everyone present. Who truly has the right to approach? Hasker blinked once, then growled. no longer sarcastic, now fully in the register of threat. "You stop right now." His voice dragged like iron chains over concrete. No one saw when his fingers reached for the grip, but by the time he drew his Glock from the belt, the metallic scrape tore through the sacred silence of a military funeral like nails across glass, cold, shrill, and so out of place it seemed to shatter the very ceremony. Everyone heard it, but no one believed it. Monroe didn't move forward, nor did she back away. She stood her ground, face to face with the muzzle now pointed at her chest. No wind passed through, yet the national flag atop the casket fluttered faintly, as if reminding them that within the stillness of this cemetery, the only thing alive was honor, and it was now staring down a barrel. "One more move, and I'll take it as a threat," Hasker hissed, arm rigid. The funeral held its breath. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Every person waited, not to see what would happen, but to see who would be held responsible for what did. Then the unthinkable happened. He shouted, not because anyone resisted, but as the final roar of someone realizing they'd lost control. "I said stop." The volume cracked the air, rupturing the gravity of the funeral. His scream was so loud the portrait at the head of the casket tilted, then tumbled from its stand, shattering on the ground. The glass cracked, the frame split open, and the photo of the young soldier, who had died on some distant border, rolled across the grass until it stopped at Monroe's feet. Every eye clung to that moment, like fingers gripping a cliff. In the heart of a funeral, a soldier had died again, not from enemy fire, but from the collapse of dignity. A lieutenant to the left of the crowd reacted on instinct and yelled, "Everyone back!" His voice rang out like the horn of an old train, echoing, then fading. But no one moved. No one dared retreat, not because they didn't hear, but because they knew. Stepping back now meant accepting that a cop could pull a gun in a military cemetery, and no one would do a thing. A white man in uniform bearing the rank of colonel, standing right next to Hasker, slowly stepped aside. He didn't speak. His shoes crossed onto the edge of the paved area, eyes looking neither at Monroe nor the gun. He looked at the casket, as if to remind himself why he was here, not to stand beside Hasker, but to see off someone who had died for their country. Control didn't flinch. The photo at her feet reflected the face of the fallen soldier, the one who had called her commander, who had entrusted his life to her hands. She didn't bend to pick it up, not out of disrespect, but because at that moment, a bowed head would be misunderstood forever. She adjusted her hold on the urn slightly, ensuring it remained upright. The earth beneath her shoes was dry and cracked, but her stance didn't shift a millimeter. No gasps, no pleading glances, just her presence, like a mountain standing between violence and honor. She looked straight into Hasker's eyes and spoke, calm, clear, no need to raise her voice. She knew, in this air so still, every word would pierce through whatever armor of self-deceit he wore. "If I die here," she said, "the entire country will know why." No one who heard it failed to feel their heartbeats skip. No one could explain why those words silenced everything. Perhaps because it wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a sworn testimony, a permanent record, and Hasker knew it. He knew he'd lost the upper hand. His hand didn't tremble, but his eyes broke. A few rows back, the mother, with the young boy in a miniature uniform, clenched her child's hand tightly. The boy didn't cry. He just looked at Monroe and the gun, with eyes not yet shaped by prejudice, not yet trained into numbness, and whispered, "Mom, is he scared of her?" The mother didn't answer. No one did, because that question, innocent as it was, touched on what no one dared to say aloud, that the one holding the gun was afraid of losing control. Then a breeze passed, not strong, not cold, but enough to lift the flag atop the casket once more. In the fading sunlight, its edge flashed like a scar against morning black. In a place where guns were never meant to exist, a gun had appeared, and the only thing standing between that weapon and an irreversible act was a woman still standing tall, eyes unshaken, hands steady, and without another word. No one moved. No one pulled out a phone. No one screamed. All froze, within a frame that, if cut from a video, would need no caption, because everything was already unmistakably clear. This was no longer about a cop and a general. This was about someone trying to preserve honor and someone trying to preserve privilege. One stood, ready to endure, one stood ready to fire, and between them lay the death of a soldier and the fragile survival of a principle called justice. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the Glock in Hasker's hand seemed redundant in a scene where each heartbeat felt like a moral stress test. The wind had stopped. The flag no longer fluttered. The cracks in the ground beneath Monroe's feet looked like fault lines, running straight into the system she now stood against, not with a weapon, not with power, but with the sheer presence of a woman in uniform, standing upright on soil that had grown used to bowing before white authority. Monroe still didn't move. Her eyes weren't fixed on the gun, but on the photo beneath her feet, the image of the fallen soldier, now lying between the muzzle and the commander who once led him. No one could hear her breathe, but everyone sensed something rising from the pit of silence, like a tremor, not yet shaking, but already fracturing the earth. And just then, the man to her left, a silver-haired three-star general, his scalp close-shaven, hand gripping a cane, slightly leaned forward, not out of reverence, but because he couldn't stand fully upright anymore. He didn't collapse, but his hand trembled. His fingers clenched the cane so tightly they turned white. A tear rolled slowly down his dry cheek, not out of fear, but shame. Shame for what he knew had been allowed to happen, and shame because he, like many others there, had stayed silent for far too long to stop it. "Don't," he whispered, not to anyone in particular. "As long as you keep standing, we might still save the system." His voice was old but not weak. It wasn't pleading. It sounded like a sentence handed down upon his generation, those who had built the walls of honor but let cracks like Hasker's slip quietly through the mortar. Monroe didn't turn to him. She heard, but her gaze remained locked on one point, the space between the gun and the ritual, where honor was being shredded into fragments by a man who didn't understand that in the military, not everyone is allowed to aim a gun, and no one is allowed to aim it at sacrifice. Hasker held his position, but his jaw tensed. Sweat ran backward across his temple, not from tension, but from the realization that he no longer controlled the silence around him. He wasn't used to being faced without being obeyed. He wasn't used to having a threat undone by a gaze. The longer he stood there, the more restless he felt inside, the very power he held. Above, a soft buzzing sound appeared. A drone hovered mid-air. No one knew where from, but its lens was zoomed in directly on Hasker's face, not the frantic zoom of media crews. A slow, deliberate focus, as if etching every wrinkle, every bead of sweat, every angle of his profile into a permanent dossier. Every twitch of his now, every flicker of his facial muscles was becoming evidence, and he knew it. He couldn't do anything about the lens, couldn't point his gun at it, couldn't shut it off. All he could do was stand there, like a crime not yet named. Behind him, in the honor guard formation, a young soldier quietly stepped back and bent toward his backpack. He pulled out a second flag, tightly rolled inside a waterproof sleeve. It wasn't meant to replace the main flag, it was backup, and that word backup said more than any speech could, because in a military funeral, no one prepares a second flag unless they know something might go wrong, which meant they knew. They knew someone might break the ritual, that someone might draw a weapon, and the soldiers had come prepared, not to mourn honor a second time. Monroe gently lifted her right heel, then set it back exactly where it had been. A motion so slight most missed it, but it was a final message. She wasn't retreating, nor advancing. She wasn't retaliating, but neither was she evading. In her hands was the urn of the fallen soldier. On her chest, rows of medals pinned by 3 different presidents. But in that moment, what kept her grounded wasn't what had been awarded. It was what she had chosen to hold. Principle. Hasker finally spoke. He didn't yell. His voice was hoarse, slow, and this time laced with something faintly resembling fear. "You're provoking me on purpose. I have the right to respond if I feel threatened." No one answered, but the way the crowd looked at him, cold and unmoving, made that sentence fall to the ground like an unspent shell, self-defeating, no rebuttal needed. Besides Monroe, the elderly general turned his head away, not because he didn't want to look, but because he couldn't bear to watch a man try to convince himself that drawing a gun at a funeral counted as being threatened. At his age, he had seen many deaths, but perhaps never one as shameful as this, the death of military integrity, choked by the phrase, "I have the right." The air in the cemetery thickened, as though each dust particle now carried weight. A dry leaf floated down near Monroe's shoe, landing without sound, a small detail, but proof that time was still passing. Only the system was stuck, caught in the space between honor and authority, between those willing to stand straight and those straining to appear righteous. A distant car horn broke the suspension. No one knew from where, but no one moved, because everyone understood the next page of this day would not be written by the press nor decided by politicians. It would be shaped by the silent presence of those who were here, those who saw a gun drawn in front of a casket, those who saw a general denied the right to approach her fallen comrade, and those who would never again be able to say, "I," because those who were present here today will carry what they witnessed for the rest of their lives, not in words, but in their eyes, in how they raise their children, whether they stay silent or speak up when the next gun is drawn where it doesn't belong. Because those who were present here today did not merely witness the truth, they became part of it. He was still standing there, his hand frozen around the Glock, his eyes scanning each face stiffened around the cemetery as if searching for someone, anyone, to justify what he had just done. But no one met his gaze, no nods of agreement, no gestures of support. And then, as if he no longer believed in the authority he held, Hasker's shoulders sagged slightly, just enough for the tension between the gun and its target to dissolve into something no longer below. A soft sound came from behind, the click of a weapon being unlatched by a military security officer. One man, then a second, approached, dressed in dark ballistic vests, hands correctly placed on their firearms. No one gave an order, but as they passed through the security perimeter and moved directly toward Hasker, everyone knew a chapter had closed, and it ended without gunfire, without shouting. Hasker turned around as he sensed the presence behind him. He didn't have time to ask, or even feign surprise, before one of the officers raised a hand signal. "Drop your weapon." The voice was neither loud nor soft, but it carried the unmistakable cadence of military command, final, non-negotiable. Hasker scoffed, unmoving. He tilted his chin up and spat. "Political cosplay. You think this is some kind of movie?" His voice slid across the benches, over the grave markers. But not a single person responded. Silence was no longer a reaction. It had become judgment. The two officers did not hesitate. One stepped forward to disarm him. The other handcuffed Hasker with practiced ease, without the need for force. Hasker froze for a moment, as if only then realizing he was never allowed to draw a gun at a military funeral, but only for a moment. Because as soon as the cuffs were on, he raised his head, locked eyes with Monroe, and spat through gritted teeth. "I know who you are." "I know exactly." No one replied. She didn't need to. With his hands cuffed behind his back, Hasker now resembled a crooked statue, the outer stone still intact, but hollowed to the core. He was escorted out of the cemetery in the heaviest silence any person might ever walk through. No boos, no applause, no looks of pity. The entire crowd remained still, not in shock, but because the shame had become collective, as if each person was asking themselves, "Why didn't we stop this sooner?" Monroe remained where she was, urn still in hand, her gaze never following Hasker. She looked straight ahead at the casket, where the shattered photograph still lay, the glass cracked, the frame chipped, but the young soldier's smile still intact. No one moved to retrieve it, not from fear, but because they were learning how to face the consequences of silence. An old man in the front row, white hair, hunched shoulders, World War II insignia on his chest, slowly stood with the help of his cane. He didn't speak for the first few minutes. He simply walked to the center aisle, right where Hasker had been taken, and struck his cane 3 times against the stone ground. Each blow echoed sharply, reverberating in the chests of those who heard it like bells of remembrance. Then he spoke, voice raspy and blunt, like sound resurrected from old trenches. Today, morality turns a page. No one applauded, but heads bowed, not to him, but to the truth just spoken, a truth that could not be taken back, could not be denied, and would not be forgotten. The faces in the crowd now resembled shards of a broken mirror, each reflecting something different. Some turned red, some shut their eyes, some tried to keep composure, but everyone understood that they, all who were present, had in some way helped turn this into a moment that could never be washed clean. 1 second, just 1 second, was all it took to draw a weapon in a place meant only for flags, ceremonial drums, and a family's grief. No one mentioned suspension. No one used the word mistake. No official promised an investigation, because the truth had already unfolded right in front of them, with cameras, witnesses, and, more frighteningly, under the gaze of hundreds of eyes bound by military honor. A gun was drawn at a funeral. A police officer was escorted out like a saboteur. And a general, without raising a hand, without speaking a word, stood still so the system would be forced to confront itself. There was nothing more to say. The ceremony resumed. The honor guard adjusted its formation. A senior officer replaced the broken photo with a new frame brought out from the auxiliary funeral hall. Every motion followed the original script, but the event was no longer the same, not because time had slowed, but because faith in what was sacred had cracked. And that crack didn't come from a bullet. It came from permission, the quiet consent that allowed someone like Hasker to rise to a place where he could draw a gun and not be stopped. The mother with the son in the miniature uniform sat still. The boy asked nothing more, but his hand clenched tighter in hers, crumpling a fold in the mourning flag laid across her lap. Perhaps what the boy learned that day wouldn't come from textbooks, but from the way no one said anything when something so wrong occurred. The funeral continued. The drum sounded 3 times. The honor shots rang out, precise, cold, slicing through the silence like blades. But what lingered wasn't the ritual. It was what had happened before, what must never happen again. 1 second to draw a gun, 1 second to lose everything, 1 second to reveal just how rotten a system had become by giving someone like Hasker that much power. But it also only took 1 second for someone like Monroe to remain still and force the entire system to make a choice, complicity or reckoning. A single second to expose the truth. 1 hour for the entire system to flinch. And less than 6 hours after that funeral, America woke up with only one question: who is she? Her name, her rank, her face, her entire military record began surfacing like an unstoppable undertow, not because the media uncovered it, but because the system that once tried to bury it now had no other choice but to lay it bare. Elise Monroe, General of the United States Army, the first black female commander in history to hold operational control over 3 strategic combat units. The woman who had a gun pointed at her during a military funeral was not an intruder, not an unnamed guest, but the very person who once led the rescue operation of 18 American soldiers from a rebel prison camp in Kandahar. Among them, the son of a state senator from Virginia who had repeatedly spoken out against diversity in the armed forces. A photograph of Monroe kneeling under gunfire, bandaging the leg of a panicked private, was recovered by the New York Times from the Pentagon's archive and featured on the front page the next morning under a blazing headline, "A general was held at gunpoint, but it's America that's on trial." There was no need for sensationalism. The cold, unembellished facts alone were enough to send a chill through public opinion. She had once led a rapid infantry battalion through 5 anti-terror operations across the Syrian border. She was the sole survivor of an ambush in Iraq and still returned with 3 wounded soldiers slung across her back. And she, according to leaked Defense Department records, had twice declined promotion to retain ground command rather than accept an administrative position at the Pentagon. Her name began appearing on Twitter, on Reddit, on military forums, but not in the usual way. No one debated party lines. No one asked whether she leaned left or right. They asked only one thing: how could something like this happen to someone like her? And why was no one able to stop it? The hashtag #FuneralGunGate surged to the top spot within 7 hours of the live stream going viral worldwide. One veteran wrote, "I've never seen my military disgraced like this, and I've never seen a general endure such humiliation with such honor." A female war correspondent who had accompanied Monroe in Mosul published a lengthy piece. "She's the only person I've ever seen who could step over a corpse and still tell her troops not to lose sight of why they carry a weapon." Not everyone agreed. A conservative senator, known for opposing gender integration in special operations, publicly defended Hasker's protocol verification. He claimed any potential threat to national security must be taken seriously, no matter who the subject is. What he didn't expect was that his only son, a Navy officer stationed in Hawaii, would post a single tweet at exactly midnight, which was shared nearly 1 million times in just 4 hours. "Dad, that woman pulled me out of a minefield in Afghanistan. Stop defending the indefensible." No debate was needed. The incident had already pieced itself together. A general, a gun, a nation long accustomed to power, now forced to relearn how to define honor. The foreign press got involved. Le Monde called it a slap in the face of American pride. The Guardian described the funeral as a surreal portrait of political battlefield and personal dignity. Yet everything circled back to a single question, echoed across every platform, every version, every perspective. Who is she, that she could shake the entire system as if it had never realized it owed her something? That evening, on national television, a veteran anchor opened the primetime broadcast with a line no one expected to ever hear on air. "There are those who hold rank, and there are those who are rank." Elise Monroe doesn't need stars on her shoulder. She makes the entire system bow just by standing still. It was no speech from her, no press release. Monroe didn't appear. She gave no interviews. Those close to her knew well it wasn't out of fear. It was because she understood that everything that needed to be said had already been said. In the moment, she chose not to retreat, not to resist, and not to step back in the face of a gun. The greatest reply a soldier can give does not lie in firing back. It lies in holding on to one's principles even while being threatened by someone wearing the same badge. The military community responded in silence. A senior Veterans Association sent an open letter to the Department of Defense, demanding a full review of the selection and promotion criteria for Joint Task Force officers. The first sentence of that letter read, "If someone like Monroe cannot be recognized even in the heart of a military cemetery, then we need to examine our eyes, our hearts, and our conscience." On that same day, major military academies across the country began hosting emergency forums on ritual, power, and the moral threshold. A cadet at West Point, interviewed after one such discussion, gave a brief response. "I don't know if I could have done what she did, but I know if I had been there that day, I would not have stayed silent." The story of Monroe began to move beyond the borders of an isolated incident. It became an unexpected symbol, not because it was glorified, but because no one could deny the raw truth captured in every second of that video. Her calmness, the grip on the urn, the way she stared straight into the face of the one holding the gun without flinching. No act was staged. No word sounded like it was trying to be correct. And that is exactly why it surpassed the notion of an incident. It became a mirror, one no one wants to look into, but no one can turn away from. Elise Monroe. That name no longer needs a rank to be called. no longer needs a unit to be verified. It has become a question turned inward, one that society now asks itself, why did it take a gun in her face for someone like her to finally be acknowledged as real? Elise Monroe's silence lasted exactly 36 hours. No statement, no appearance, no signal. While the nation argued over whether she would speak up like a hero or retreat like a victim, she submitted a single document to the Federal Department of Justice. I will testify as a witness, not a victim. No embellishments, no legal team requested, no lawyer speaking on her behalf. Just one sentence, yet enough to ignite the next phase. The moment the law must speak. The Federal Department of Justice responded in less than 6 hours after the document was received. A press release appeared on the government portal, with no accompanying press conference, no emotional dressing, but words as cold and sharp as a blade. The incident involving the unwarranted use of armed force by a police officer within a national military ceremonial zone is under investigation for violation of human rights and desecration of a national military. The hearing will be made public. Just 3 paragraphs, 25 lines, yet the key words rang out like alarm bells. Unwarranted force, violation of human rights, desecration of national military right. For the first time, a police officer was not being investigated for overreach in a civilian setting, but was being prosecuted under federal charges within the most sacred environment of national service. An act deemed not just legally wrong, but sacrilegious in symbolic terms. From within the military, the response was no less severe. A series of leaked internal emails from the Joint Chiefs revealed that more than 35 active generals signed a petition demanding that the case be tried publicly before the national press, citing the reason, not just to protect an individual, but to defend the moral boundaries of the entire force. In a private letter sent directly to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a retired 4-star general wrote, "No one who has ever served under Monroe would misunderstand what is being tested here. This is no longer about personal honor. It is about the legitimacy of a nation." The opposing side also began to shape its defense. Robert Hasker, after several quiet days in custody, publicly selected his defense attorney, a notorious but familiar name, the same lawyer who once represented the January Capitol riot defendants. In his first press conference, this lawyer did not apologize, did not reconcile, but declared bluntly, "My client acted in his duty. Any exercise of authority is justified if security is perceived to be at risk, and no one can prove he did not feel threatened." A dangerous argument, but razor-sharp. It did not defend the action. It defended the feeling, and in a country where personal emotions are increasingly used as justification for behavior, that is a double-edged blade, deadly and unpredictable. While public opinion split in two, the veteran community issued a rare response. A coalition of more than 60 veteran organizations sent an open letter to Congress and the Department of Justice with a headline, "Do not turn justice into a political rehearsal." In the letter they wrote, "We do not care what party Monroe belongs to. We care that a military funeral was turned into a site of rank desecration. And if that is not enough to force the system to reconsider itself, then the system has forfeited its right to exist." Amid rising media pressure, a leaked video from within the state police department, verified to be from a security team briefing before the funeral, pushed tensions to a whole new level. In the footage, lasting less than 1 minute, a voice believed to be Hasker's rang out clearly, unedited, "Listen to me. If any colored person tries to get into the ceremonial line without being on the list, I'll teach them a lesson right there in the cemetery." So they know where the line is. The video spread in less than 3 hours. The Attorney General was called upon to respond. In a special press briefing held in Washington, he did not read a prepared statement. He did not cite legal theory. He spoke only one sentence. "I don't care who the person with the gun pointed at them was. I care why the person holding the gun thought they had the right to do it." Public outcry exploded. The media scrambled. But at the eye of the storm, Monroe remained silent. No press responses, no attempts at defense. The only person who made contact with her during the 3-day investigation was the Assistant United States Attorney. According to their account, Monroe said just one thing: "I did not come to be defended. I came to see how justice shapes itself when there is no threat attached." The official indictment was announced at the preliminary hearing. Hasker was charged with 5 counts: use of a weapon in a federally protected ceremonial zone, racially motivated threat, abuse of authority, obstruction of military rights, and desecration of the dignity of a national service member. The final charge under federal law carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Subsequent hearings were ordered to be held publicly. Federal Courtroom Number 3 in Washington, D.C., was designated for proceedings. The entire investigation record was ordered to remain intact and unaltered, and, more importantly, no individual, not even those in political office, would be allowed to interfere with the jury. The law was no longer a choice. It had become a duty, not just to punish, but to make one thing clear. The honor of someone in uniform cannot be threatened at gunpoint and then soothed with a late apology. No system has the right to allow that to happen without consequence. The indictment ink had not yet dried. The first news articles were still hot off the press. Courtroom Number 3 in Washington had not yet opened its doors, but somewhere far from juries, federal statutes, and streams of argumentative tweets, a letter was sent. It was not typed on government stationery, bore no official emblem, no legal certification. It was handwritten in blue ink on plain white paper, sent from an address no one noticed, a small town on the outskirts of Missouri, where the mother of the soldier who died at that funeral was living alone. "My son died for America," she wrote, "but America didn't keep its promise to him, not even at his funeral." It wasn't an accusation. It didn't carry anger. The words were soft, even, but sharp as a needle, pointing precisely where no one wanted to look. Her name was Ruth Darnell. Her son was Sergeant Mason Darnell, who died during his 3rd deployment on the Syrian border in a midnight ambush when his unit lost contact with command. He was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart. His funeral took place at Arlington with full military honors until a gun that should never have been there appeared. Ruth's letter was brief. Just 2 pages, yet it was shared millions of times on social media, read aloud by dozens of journalists on national television, not because of literary flair, but because of one final line that left America with no excuse to look away. "He once told me, if I die, ask General Monroe to say a few words for me, and in the end, they didn't even let her come near my son's body." One simple sentence, enough to shake the media to its core. Within less than 6 hours of the letter's release, a close friend of Mason's from the same unit shared a page from his combat diary, handwritten and still stained with sand and sweat. In it, Mason had written, "If something happens to me, I hope Ms. Monroe delivers the eulogy. Doesn't have to be long, just her voice. Hearing her voice over gunfire is what kept me from panicking." No one could script something that moving, and no one could justify pointing a gun at Monroe as she approached the casket. The following day, at St. Mary's Church in Georgia, where the Darnell family had worshipped for 3 generations, a prayer service was held not to mourn the dead, but to preserve the honor still alive. A banner, handwritten in bold brown cursive, hung outside the church. "We pray for the values that once were the backbone of this nation, not to recover them, but so we do not forget." There were no news cameras, no prestigious guests, just around 40 people, mostly aging veterans, kneeling beside wooden pews, quietly reciting prayers. No one mentioned Monroe's name. No one condemned anyone, but in their eyes was a silent consensus. This time, it must not be allowed to pass like all the others. Immediately after the service, the presiding priest, Father Reuben Ellis, 64 years old, was invited to attend a routine blessing ceremony for the local police department. He declined, not with rage or protest, but with a single line in an email: "I cannot bless a place that once pointed a gun at honor." A small gesture, but in the world of faith, It was a withdrawal of grace, a bell that rang without being struck. The public's reaction was no longer mass outrage. It transformed into a slow, deep, and irreversible current. Veteran groups across the country began quietly reorganizing gatherings, not to discuss campaigns or policies, but to talk about dignity. An old soldier in New Mexico recounted, "I've seen my comrades die of thirst, but I've never seen a general forbidden from approaching her soldier." The matter no longer resembled a lawsuit. It had morphed into a generational reckoning. A generation long silent out of fear of complexity. A generation that used to say, "This, too, shall pass." But this time, they had waited too long to let it pass once more. Those who had been present at the funeral, the living witnesses, began writing letters by hand, not as legal complaints but as observation journals. One mother recorded every expression on her son's face when the gun was drawn. A military medic documented the irregular blood pressure readings of elderly veterans seated behind her as they witnessed the scene unfold. Line by line, detail by detail. Not dramatic, not sensational, but sharper than any piece of evidence. Academics began calling it the phenomenon of slow accumulated moral reaction. When a society long used to shutting its eyes is suddenly forced to open them, not by will, but because honor is no longer theoretical, it is now inside an urn that people were not allowed to bring to its rightful place. On forums for Black service members, a new slogan began to spread. "We've been waiting for so long. No explanation needed." Anyone who had ever worn the uniform understood. It wasn't a demand, it was an indictment of a patience stretched to its very breaking point. The silence surrounding Robert Hasker did not last long. Those who choose to aim weapons at honor often leave traces behind. And the system, though it once covered them up, though it once looked the other way, when forced to confront itself, will follow those traces like dried blood on cold stone. 7 days after the official indictment was issued, internal personnel files from the state police department, where Hasker had served for 13 years, were leaked. Amid the dense stack of documents, there was one particular complaint, handwritten by Hasker himself in the year 2012. The slanted handwriting addressed clearly to Personnel Command of Military District 7, Fort Bragg. The reason for the complaint? Rejected not due to physical standards but because of political factors. Accompanying that was an accusation underlined 3 times in red pen. This unit tends to favor black soldiers. The author of that complaint was a 29-year-old man, Robert J. Hasker, who had just been disqualified from the enlistment list for failing the initial psychological screening. In the letter, he argued that he met all physical requirements, had no criminal record, and possessed a clear motivation to serve, and that he had been excluded on the grounds of allegedly lacking emotional control under pressure. But the most notable part was not in the form. It was in the handwritten note scrawled at the bottom margin, where Hasker wrote, "If someone like me isn't allowed to serve, then people like them don't deserve to be called soldiers." No one read that letter in that year, or rather, no one wanted to acknowledge it. But when the incident at Arlington erupted, people began tracing it back to its roots, and those roots did not emerge from a clerical error. They sprang from a deliberate ideology, one who was denied honor, choosing to weaponize that rejection against those who were granted it. In an interview conducted 4 years ago, part of a documentary series titled Perspectives from the Keepers of the Streets, Hasker once said, "I can't live in a world where people wear ranks they don't deserve. When you realize you're losing, but losing to a rigged game, breaking the rules isn't wrong anymore. It becomes inevitable." The host chuckled and asked, "What do you mean by that?" Hasker answered without hesitation. "If I weren't chosen to be among them, then I'll be the one guarding the gate." No one fully grasped the implications of that statement at the time, but now, with those words placed within the larger frame, the act of drawing a gun at a funeral, The way he looked at Monroe, everything seemed stripped of camouflage. He was never merely a protocol officer. He was a man who believed his rightful place had been stolen and who sought to reclaim it by aiming his gun at someone who had embodied honor far beyond his reach. In the military psychological assessment from 2012, the conclusion by the evaluating physician was a single line: no more, no less. Candidate displays signs of a damaged value system, exhibits uncontrollable responses when encountering individuals who surpass his criteria. Not a diagnosis, not a disorder, but a form of self-suggested narrative of stolen superiority. Hasker did not hate because he lost. He hated because he believed the winner had taken a false route, false in the eyes of a man whose internal scale had long rusted from unearned pride. During a post-indictment search of his residence, investigators found a small, old notebook with a dark leather cover, containing no notes except 4 words written in red ink, sealed at the back of the notebook: "I will take back." No date, no recipient. But the handwriting was identical to the final line of the rejected enlistment complaint from years ago. And that, according to behavioral analysts, revealed that this was no impulsive outburst. It was a smoldering vow, nurtured by resentment, fed by hatred, and driven by a need to define oneself, by stripping others of their rightful identity. Those who once worked alongside Hasker also began to speak, not publicly, not before the media, but enough to form a picture no longer shrouded in ambiguity. An officer who had been on patrol during Hasker's first year on the force recalled he rarely spoke, but whenever the commanding officer was black, he'd come back mumbling. These days, if you know how to talk politics, you climb faster than a bullet. Every past remark, every forgotten document, has now become evidence, not to exonerate, but to clarify. This was not a man pushed into error. This was a man who had traveled a long road, waiting for his chance to strike. And that chance, in bitter irony, came in a cemetery. Federal Courtroom Number 3, Monday morning. No one spoke. No one adjusted their tie. No one dared glance at their phone, not even for a second. Everyone sat upright, as if this place held not only the eyes of a judge, but the gaze of an entire nation peering into a mirror that had never been wiped clean. The face of justice, unpainted, uncostumed, and this time, leaving no room for evasion. Elise Monroe walked in, not as a performance, not posing, not scanning for cameras. She walked as someone who had once stepped over scorched sand, crossed enemy outposts, and advanced through crossfire without waiting for a signal. Her uniform was crisp, the 4-star insignia on her left shoulder gleaming under white lights. Her medals worn in full, not to claim glory, but to underline the only order still intact in a country growing blurry between symbol and substance. What is paid for in blood, no one has the right to rewrite with words. She raised her hand to swear in, her gaze unwavering. The clerk read her name, age, and rank. No one blinked. When invited to sit, Monroe spoke softly, clearly, with no need for prompting. "I will stand." Her voice was not loud, but loud enough for the entire room to understand. Today, she had no intention of sitting down in a courtroom, where injustice had stood up long ago. Hasker's attorney stepped forward, a man in his 50s, dark suit, sunken eyes, smile thin as a blade hidden up his sleeve. He didn't start with a question. He stared at Monroe as if studying a finely tuned piece of marketing, then opened with an unsolicited remark. "Ma'am, today you wear your uniform. Is that to make people forget you're the one who was hurt?" Monroe did not respond. Her eyes were not angry, but neither were they tolerant. She only stood a little straighter, her shoulders squarer, and said, "I wear the uniform because the one I want to speak of no longer lives to wear it." The lawyer raised his brows. "Then tell me, are you here today as a witness or a political symbol?" He emphasized symbol as if it were a stain, not an honor. The courtroom fell silent, not out of surprise, but because everyone understood that the question was precisely what had split America in half. Monroe looked straight at the attorney, unblinking. She slowly unbuttoned the left side of her jacket, pulled out a small box, and placed it on the witness stand. A purple heart medal, awarded by the president in a ceremony without media, without speeches, without cameras. She said, her voice steady as before, "I have bled, I have nearly died, I left part of my body behind in a place no one dared fly over, and I do not need pity." The attorney sat down. He could not counter it. He merely scribbled something in his notebook, but everyone knew no words could dull the red on that metal, and none could stop the answer that had been forged over a lifetime of service. The judge gave a subtle nod. "Ms. Monroe, you may proceed with your statement." No further prompting was needed. Elise did not glance at any notes, did not read from a script. She simply spoke, as though each word had already been carved into her spine. "I did not come here to list the battles I've been through. I came because someone thought they had the right to draw a gun in the middle of a sacred ceremony on the person who once commanded the unit that kept American soldiers alive in enemy territory." She paused, leaving no room for interruption, then continued, "I have been ambushed by the Taliban. I lost part of my arm to a landmine, but I had never had a gun pointed at me until I wore my uniform on American soil." Second, 2 seconds. The courtroom sank into a thick, heavy silence, not out of sentiment, but because no one could look away. No one could pretend it was just a line. No one was brazen enough to call it a coincidence. No one dared to say, "I didn't know this happened." A juror, the only white woman on the panel, drew in a long breath, not from fear, not from discomfort, but because she had just realized she wasn't being asked to judge right from wrong, but to decide whether America still had enough honor to call this justice. Hasker's attorney stood again, his tone no longer mocking but still sharp like a saw blade. "Then what do you say to those who claim you're being used as a symbol to let justice be swayed by emotion?" Monroe tilted her head, unshaken, unoffended. She asked calmly, "What emotion?" He replied, "The public's anger." Monroe nodded, then said, without raising her voice but each word striking like a chisel, "If the public is angry, then they are angry for me, because I do not have time to be angry. I am too busy standing still so they don't have to bow before a system that has already collapsed." No one spoke further. No one needed to, because in this courtroom there would be no victor. Only one thing remained standing, the truth. And that truth, wearing a uniform, bearing scars, carrying a medal, stood tall, looked straight ahead, and waited for no permission to be named. The courtroom no longer echoed with coughs. Not even the clicking of cameras remained. Even the rustling of the clerk's papers seemed swallowed by the thickening air rising by the second. Every ounce of attention converged on one point, 2 individuals standing less than 4 steps apart. One wore a uniform, spines straight, hands free. The other wore a prison jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, eyes devoid of remorse, replaced only by the hardened dullness forged from long-standing resentment. The court called out, confrontation between defendant Robert James Hasker and witness General Elise Monroe commence. No one spoke. Haskey stood, collar twisted, his smile slanting slightly to the left corner of his lips, as if this confrontation was the performance he'd waited his whole life to deliver. He didn't wait for a question, he spoke first. "I don't know who trained you," he said, voice steady, each word pulled slowly like a sharpened blade. "But I know one thing. Someone who's seen real combat doesn't flinch at the sight of a Glock, especially when it hasn't fired." Monroe didn't reply. She didn't resist. She didn't need to. Her gaze moved slowly, not toward his face, but toward a folded map placed before the witness stand. She opened it, not hastily, but with enough finality that every eye followed each crease. An aged map unfolded, not a reprint from military academies, but an original tactical chart of Afghanistan, its edges worn by rain, dust, and time. She pointed to a spot in the Kunduz desert, marked with 3 concentric red circles. "I was ambushed here. That year I led a joint unit, lost contact with headquarters for 3 days. No reinforcements, no satellite signal. But I still got 6 people out." She paused, looked up. "One of those 6 was a son of Senator Cramer, who, I've been told, once advocated against prosecuting you." No applause, no gasps, but a moral tremor, wordless, struck the collective chest of the entire courtroom. Truth does not need a microphone to echo. Hasker gave a faint chuckle, his head tilted slightly to the right. "So you can shoot," he said, his tone like glass scraping metal. "But you can't stand to have a gun pointed at you. How amusing." A few in the room held their breath, not because the remark was profound, but because the shamelessness of each word had breached the limits of human decency. Yet Monroe did not react. She looked directly forward, no flinching, no movement. 3 seconds passed, she responded, as though naming a kind of wound that once belonged to her. "I don't refuse being targeted. I refuse to bow." That sentence was no strike. It was a verdict, not for the man in front of her, but for anyone who ever believed that honor could be pressed down by nothing more than a curled finger on a trigger. Hasker's lawyer began to rise, but the judge's glance halted him. No further defense was needed, because Hasker's presence, the way he looked at the woman who had once saved the child of the man protecting him, had confessed everything that needed to be confessed. Monroe was not finished. She walked slowly toward the evidence podium, pulling from her pocket a printed copy of the 2012 complaint, the same document Hasker had submitted when rejected from military enlistment. She held it up. "This is the only thing that surprised me in this entire case," she said, turning her eyes toward the jury. "He didn't draw his weapon because he saw me as a threat. He drew it because he didn't believe I deserved to wear the uniform, something he never qualified to put on." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was complete and piercing. Then, for the first time since the confrontation began, she looked directly at Hasker. She showed neither contempt nor anger. She simply said, softly, as though uttering the last truth left unspoken, "That wasn't just a gun. It was a hand that never had the right to hold it." No one dared move. No one could continue to look at the defendant as just an individual. Hasker no longer represented misconduct. He represented a harsher truth, that some enter the system not to protect it, but to use it as a weapon against those who make them feel inferior. Monroe bowed slightly before the court, not in submission, but as a soldier completing her field report. Then she stepped down from the stand, never turning back, needing no validation from anyone, because the only validation she needed was the truth just laid bare, in a place once thought too tight with technicalities to breathe. The confrontation ended. No one won. No one clapped. But one thing had become clearer than ever. This was no longer a trial of the man who pulled the trigger. This was the trial of those who refused to look in the mirror. He entered the system not by honor, but by a hunger to become someone others feared. Robert James Hasker was never a symbol of competence, never once mentioned by his peers as a role model, but he knew how to survive, how to slip through the cracks of a system riddled with loopholes, and how to turn the very disdain he harbored for others into a kind of armor, not to conceal himself, but to make people hesitate before peeling him open. Throughout the trial, the media's spotlight clung tightly to the confrontation between him and General Monroe. But once the lights dimmed, newsrooms began digging through the dust that had been deliberately buried, and what was unearthed was no longer an individual who broke rules. It was a system that had waved him through, cloaked in notoriety. A leaked video from a camera at Randolph Elementary School in North Carolina, dated 2016, blew up across social media overnight. In the 2.5-minute clip, Hasker, then serving as a liaison security officer, was seen restraining a 10-year-old black boy. The child was crying out, his hands bound behind him with plastic zip ties, lying face down on the playground pavement, while Hasker shouted, "This one's wandering, refuses to identify, not allowed to move." His voice was dry, void of logic. He then nudged the boy's leg with his boot, sneered, and spoke into his radio. "One subject attempting to breach restricted zone. Request residential verification." The report at the time concluded, handled according to protocol, no excessive force. The case was closed in just 3 days. Not long after that clip resurfaced, a female officer who had previously worked directly under Hasker at the State Police Department appeared on CNN, publicly testifying. "He once slapped me in the elevator because I didn't stand at attention when he spoke." The woman, whose identity remained undisclosed for safety reasons, provided a copy of the internal complaint she had filed with the department's inspection board, but the file was gone. The case was marked "Original document missing, unable to verify." That was the first time she left the force, and the last time she ever wore the uniform. But the final straw came from an often overlooked paper, the Jackson Dispatch, where an amateur journalist unearthed a copy of the internal personnel review logs from the state police department spanning the last 10 years. Hasker's name appeared 8 times, linked to 8 violations, ranging from racially charged remarks, coercive behavior, to tampering with security cameras. Each was resolved with one of 2 phrases: counseled or insufficient evidence. No one dared call it protection, but no one was naive enough to call it a coincidence. On the very night the story aired, a white man with silver hair and a thick Southern accent appeared on national television. He introduced himself plainly. "My name is George Millstone. I used to be Robert Hasker's direct superior." Without preamble, he looked straight into the camera, his gaze unflinching. "I approved keeping him on after 3 complaints, because I thought a few rough edges weren't enough to dismiss someone who could keep order. Now I realize, by not removing him, I greenlit a moral execution." Not everyone was convinced. Some politicians still spoke of incomplete procedures, and a few right-leaning outlets cited the right to self-defense. But truth doesn't wait for consensus. It only needs to be exposed. And once exposed, it doesn't go back into hiding. A special consolidated report released later by the Federal Commission on Executive Ethics confirmed Robert James Hasker was not an isolated incident. He was the repeated product of a systemically permissive chain, where records disappeared, witnesses were silenced, and authority was entrusted to hands that never knew how to hold it. No one stepped forward to accept collective responsibility. No institution issued an apology with a specific name. But one truth became blindingly clear. Hasker had never been a misstep. He was the precise symptom of a sequence of decisions wrong, but dressed up in the name of order. Now he no longer smiled in court, no longer looked at Monroe with defiance. His face had stiffened, not from fear of sentencing, but because every act he had once shielded with coarse language, every abuse he had masked with aggression, was now being returned to him in the one form he could not endure: the truth. He fell for the truth, not by a verdict, not by the fists of public opinion, but by fragments of evidence. Stories once discarded, details everyone saw but no one spoke of, until silence was no longer possible. And as the shadow of a man stripped bare still staggered before the bench, from the opposite side, hundreds of other shadows began to emerge, not in suits, not as scholars, but in a different form, as soldiers. No one invited them, no one organized them into a block. There was no media team, no slogans, no hashtags. But on the 9th day of the trial, as the jury entered deliberation, more than 100 black veterans collectively signed a 4-page declaration, beginning not with an argument, but with a single line: "We once kept quiet, not because we didn't know, but because we believed someone else would speak for us. But if Elise Monroe's not protected, then none of us has any value left." The declaration did not ask for forgiveness. It did not appeal. It issued no accusation. It simply told, through the battlefield experiences of those who had survived, who had breathed the same air as she did, and who had witnessed not just how she commanded, but how much dignity she preserved in places where death was the only thing distributed equally. Sergeant Glenn Porter, now retired, who served alongside Monroe in Helmand Province in 2010, wrote, "She was the first to jump from the vehicle when the mine exploded, and the last to leave the rally point, after she had carried every wounded soldier out. The only time I ever bowed my head to a superior, it wasn't because of her rank, but because she held the dignity of our entire unit in the exact moment I thought I had nothing left to hold on to." No one reads that line without feeling their throat tighten, not because Monroe had been deified, but because those who had lived at the edge of death were now confirming She was among the rare few who didn't turn power into a pedestal, but into a place to shield others. Southern Florida, a soldier suffering from PTSD who had fought in the same mission with Monroe in Kandahar, sat before a local news camera, his face marked with post-traumatic tics, but his gaze sharp as glass. My daughter keeps asking me who's an ideal role model. I never named a princess. I said Monroe, not because she's perfect, but because when I broke down in the rubble, she pulled me out without even asking who I was. No music bed was needed, no dramatics. These testimonies carried their own weight, and in a courtroom trying to draw lines between honor and entitlement, such voices became the foundation that could no longer be dismissed. The final story, and the anchor of the declaration, came from a former Navy SEAL who had never appeared before the media. In a handwritten letter, 3 paragraphs long, he wrote, "I had been wounded in the leg. Monroe bandaged me right at the outpost. When I came to, I told her straight, I don't want to be saved by a woman. She just looked at me, didn't get angry, didn't smile, didn't reply, but her hand never let go of my leg until the medics arrived. Today I write this, not to make amends, but to say this: the person I once insulted is the only one I owe my life to." They said Monroe was cold. They called her the Iron Woman. But these stories did not describe her with words. They built her like bricks, raw, rough, chipped, but stacked in a way that no one could shake. No need for ornament, no need for slogans. She wasn't protected by reputation. She was surrounded by those who had fallen and had been lifted by her off the battlefield. The media reported it, but they didn't color it. Neutral outlets condemned the system. Conservative outlets couldn't ignore it, because this time, the ones speaking were not journalists, not attorneys. They were soldiers, those who once held each other's lives by a thread of blood and were now holding justice by stories no one else could rewrite. The letter ended with one line, not polished like a slogan, but like a period that ended all debate. If justice does not stand with Monroe, then it has already fallen. The trial entered its 13th day. The wooden benches in the courtroom were no longer seats for spectators. They had become rows of history, where every small movement, averted eyes, a stammered testimony, a trembling hand in air as cold as steel, carried the potential to strike at the very system each person was trying to keep upright. But this was no longer a place for balance, because truth, by its nature, does not require. It only needs to be spoken. The first to take the stand was Lieutenant Frederick Hale, a white police officer who had worked directly with Hasker for 6 years in the administrative unit. His record was clean, his performance average. But when faced with the question, were you ever instructed to ignore Hasker's misconduct, he froze. 3 seconds, then 5, a dry swallow. Then his voice shattered into the courtroom like a pane of glass, struck dead center by a hammer. We were ordered to look away. The room exploded in silence. No one seated near him dared move. No one from the legal team dared interrupt, because that answer was not a testimony, it was a systemic confession. The judge called for document citations, and then an internal memo was read aloud before the court, dated November 18, 21, titled Unstable Behavior Report on Officer Hasker, Not for Disclosure. The line in the center of the page stood out like a scar that had never scabbed. Hasker is dangerous but useful. Keep him under control. No one needed interpretation. No attorney needed to underline the text. The language of the system had already indicated itself. Immediately after, the prosecution requested the release of additional materials, including internal message exchanges between unit commanders. After several minutes of debate, the judge permitted the disclosure of 3 message threads. The shortest was a single text from the duty captain to a subordinate, sent 3 days before the funeral. Let him rough up the brass if he wants to. It'll keep them in line. The courtroom froze. The crowd didn't shout. They didn't have to. Because every word, punctuation mark, struck their hearts like the gavel of a verdict not yet announced. They knew. They chose to stay silent. And then, something unprecedented in the history of the state's law enforcement occurred. From the gallery, the state police commissioner, James O'Connor, stepped forward. He had not been subpoenaed. He was not on the witness list, but he stood tall, eyes heavy as if bearing a sack of stones tied to his chest, and began to speak. "I request to address the court, not as an official, but as a man who allowed a broken system to continue existing." The entire courtroom held its breath. O'Connor did not look at Monroe. He did not look at Hasker. He looked only at the jury and continued, "I read the reports. I saw the complaints. I approved letting them stay buried in a drawer, and because of that, I do not ask for forgiveness. I only ask that everyone see this clearly. It was not one officer who drew a weapon. It was an entire system that loaded the chamber." The courtroom had not yet settled from the violent confrontation when the left side door opened. No one said a word. No one gave a signal, but everyone knew it was his turn. Hasker stood up. He didn't bow his head. He showed no remorse. His suit was still perfectly pressed, as if he had just stepped out of a political gala, not a federal holding cell. His steps were neither rushed nor hesitant. Each one was a challenge, not to the court, but to the very definition of order this trial had been trying to uphold. No one stopped him, because no one knew whether doing so would shatter everything ahead of schedule. Hasker scanned the room, his eyes stripping the layers off every face, not with a knife, but with the cruel precision of someone who had once sat at the heart of power. Then he stood tall, hands uncuffed, unrestrained. One attorney moved to remind him of procedural limits, then paused, not out of fear, but because he understood. Any warning now would only sound ridiculous. "You want me to tell the truth?" he began, his voice level, lacking theatrics but grinding each syllable out like a garrote on a hypocrite's throat. "Fine. Then listen closely. I'm not the monster you all sculpted for your television dramas. I'm not your ideal villain for the system to hang and drain its guilt. I am your most perfect product, born of promoted silence, of ethics programmed to dodge reality." The room was so quiet that the unconscious tapping of a juror's fingernail on the wooden armrest could be heard like a metronome. Hasker stared straight into their eyes, the people chosen to represent justice, and spoke with the syrupy venom of a serpent. "Don't sit there pretending to be righteous. I only did what you all think about but never dare say. I signed off on detaining black men without evidence because it balanced the numbers. I approved budgets for juvenile detention because it secured my next election. I know this machine runs on silent consent, and I was just the one with the guts to name it." A female reporter dropped her pen. Her hands shook, not sure if from fury or the realization that she had once quoted him without challenge. Juror number 9, an older man in a blue suit, furrowed his brow, not in anger, but as if caught in that strange line between truth and revulsion. "Don't tell me I'm wrong," Hasker snapped, seeing heads begin to shake. "When you've been silent for decades, don't pretend to be shocked. When a child is stripped and interrogated in a precinct and the press says nothing, when a mother is deported for missing a medical appointment, where were you? Where were you, huh?" His voice rose, but not like a man losing control, more like one who knows exactly when to drive the blade deeper into the heart of moral pretense. No one in the room could look directly at him anymore. Hasker turned toward the jury box, where every face had begun to crack. Some looked at him with hatred, others with disgust. But the most dangerous was the man in the back row, now bowed, hand covering his mouth, shoulders shaking violently. A sob escaped into the dead air. "Ah," Hasker sneered, lip curling with wicked delight. "Looks like I hit the pus pocket." His voice dripped with triumphant malice. "If I'm going to prison, then this America is coming with me. Not because I'm a hero, but because I'm a mirror warped by your evasive glances, your callous clicks, and all the times you chose silence to protect your pretty little reputations." The juror was crying now, not because he pitied Hasker, but because part of what he said echoed a private dread, that he had once cast a blank vote on a discriminatory bill, once ignored a report of misconduct, said, "I don't have enough information to object," and today, in this room, that silence was being ripped open not by truth, but by a man who dragged society into the mud with him. The judge moved to interrupt, but Hasker raised his hand, not signaling, just holding it up quietly like some cult priest offering benediction. He didn't need more time. He had already sewn collapse into every crack of the courtroom's mask of justice. "You can sentence me to 10 years, 20, maybe life," he hissed through clenched teeth. "But remember, in the moment you condemn me, you also condemn the myth that we are better than our past. No, you're not better. You're just better at covering it up." The cameraman's hand trembled, throwing the frame off axe. The broadcast director in the control room cursed not at the technical issue, but because no one dared cut the feed. Social media ignited. The hashtag #IFamGuilty surged like mushrooms after rain, not in support of Hasker, but as proof that he had cracked the most fragile wall of all, the belief that, at least, I'm not part of the problem. "Yes," he exhaled, "I am guilty, but I'm not alone, and that's why I'll sleep better than you tonight." No one clapped, no one spoke, but everyone knew he hadn't asked for forgiveness. He had cursed the room with the most venomous benediction possible. The final silence was not reserved for the victor. It belonged to the one who failed, but managed to bring the tower down with him, using nothing but his voice. And in that moment, those who remained in the courtroom, whether repulsed, enraged, or afraid, had to admit the mask had fallen. No one was innocent, no one remained unstained, and no one would walk out of there wearing white. The room had yet to catch its breath after Hasker's final words when the sound of the clerk's shoes echoed, slow and steady, like the wooden clack of a ritual drum before a funeral. No one gave a cue. No one barked a command, but everyone knew the moment of judgment had arrived. Not a single camera trembled, not a whisper, not a gasp. The entire space felt held in someone's palm, not by force, but by a kind of silence willingly offered up like a sacrifice. The jury foreman stood. The paper in his hand did not shake, but his eyes, despite having lived more than half a life within the legal system, could not hide their fracture. He did not look at anyone, not at the defendant, not at Monroe, not at his fellow jurors. He stared straight ahead into an invisible void, as though reading a farewell to an era he once believed was untouchable. We, the people's jury, after a thorough review of all evidence, testimonies, and the public trial proceedings, sentenced the defendant, Hasker L. Reynold, to life imprisonment without parole. No one screamed, no one sobbed, no fists slammed, no applause erupted. Only one sound broke through, louder than any judgment ever handed down. Laughter. A rough, cracked, violent laugh that made the air in the courtroom shrink away from itself. Hasker laughed, not the laugh of a man defeated, not the laugh of a madman. He laughed as if, at last, the world had admitted what he had always known, that it had always been a tragic farce, and now the curtain had finally fallen. He stood slowly, unaided, his eyes, sharp like an old blade, rusted but still sharp enough to cut flesh, swept across everyone who had once sat in judgment of him. In the end, guns don't kill, he spat, each word like blood coughed into the air. But fear kills everyone. No one replied, because no one knew how to answer something so right and so vile at the same time. Those who had believed justice to be solid now had to watch it tremble in the hands of the man just convicted, and it was that trembling, not the sentence, that became the real judgment. No one stood, no one moved. The entire courtroom seemed frozen by a truth no one dared to name. The criminal had been sentenced, but the stains he dragged behind him remained untouched. People bowed their heads, not out of grief, not out of respect. They bowed, as one does at a funeral, not for a person but for an illusion, once built from laws, lectures, and honorary degrees. Monroe remained seated, her eyes facing forward, though not looking at Hasker. Her gaze was light, deep, and far away, as though reaching beyond the room toward something more important, an unfinished memory. In the back row, a boy around 8 sat silently on the bench. He was the same one who had asked her at the funeral, "What is that man doing?" That innocent question had become the real verdict for this society. Because it didn't demand justice, it asked, what justice even meant. She turned her head, just for a moment, not to answer, but so the boy would understand. Some things need no reply. Actions are the only true response. In that fleeting instant, their eyes met, forming a quiet pact that truth isn't what people declare, it's what they can no longer avoid. Oscar was taken away. No one waved, no one watched, but no one closed their eyes. In that moment he stepped through the door. The courtroom ceased to be a courtroom. It became a crypt. Where the final gavel did not strike wood, it struck the last ounce of belief that a generation had in the righteousness of law. And then, like a ritual pre-written but never performed, the sentence was finished, and no one stood, not out of fatigue, not out of disrespect, but because standing is a reflex of those who still believe in some noble form. And here, the last noble thing had been killed, not by the crime, but by the truth. This was not a trial. It was a funeral for an era that once believed justice knew its way home. At first, it was just a small folded piece of paper stuck to the cold stone on the eastern side of the Federal Military Cemetery wall. No name, no address, just 4 words, trembling handwriting in black ink on white paper. I turned my back. No one knew who did it first, but precisely because no one knew, no one could stop what came after, as if the entire nation was being forced to relearn how to bow, not before a verdict, but before a truth long buried beneath gold-plated honor. Within 3 days after the trial, hundreds had arrived. No one called for them. No one organized it. They simply came, carrying paper and guilt. Each apology was written in its hand, with its shame in the voice of a generation that once believed not seeing meant not being involved. Some wrote only 1 sentence, some crossed out lines repeatedly, some cried before pressing their note onto the stone wall, but no one looked back. A boy about 9 years old, wearing a red shirt with a torn shoulder, wrote faintly in pencil, "I don't know why adults have to relearn how to treat heroes." His note was placed next to another. "I'm a history teacher, and I never taught about Dana Monroe because I was afraid the students would ask why. The 2 pieces didn't speak to each other, but side by side, they became a requiem without music, a silent dirge with no low notes, only the echo of quiet once mistaken as harmless." A soldier from Louisiana, silver hair, slumped shoulders, lingered for more than 5 hours at the central stone. He didn't cry, he didn't kneel, he simply stood, then posted a brief line at the main gate, where guards usually checked credentials. "Sorry for the time I clapped when he was promoted." A small line, like a thin blade, but one that pierced through the layers of metals once pinned to men like Hasker. And then, those who had once served under him, not in groups, not by schedule, came quietly, adding new slips of paper. One police officer, never seen in public before, cap low, mask on, sunglasses hiding his face, arrived just past midnight. He wrote neither quickly nor slowly, peeled back the tape, pressed his note onto the wall, then stepped away. No glances, no words. His message read, "We didn't stay silent because we didn't see, but because we were afraid of seeing ourselves." A confession so cold it seemed to freeze the air around the memorial into untempered steel. No rebuttal followed. No one condemned him, because truth even from the shadows weighs heavier than 1,000 polished speeches from podiums. By the 5th day, people stopped using ordinary paper. A group of architecture students arrived, bringing rough blueprints. No permits, no sponsors, no contractor signatures. They simply erected a hollow steel frame, 3 meters tall, open in the middle, enough for the wind to pass through and carry the notes into its core. It wasn't a traditional monument. No portraits, no relief, only apology notes, 1,326 of them pressed onto every face of the frame, built from recycled steel panels salvaged from former detention center gates, steel that once locked away the innocent, now holding confessions. People called it the Wall of Apologies, not by official decree, but by whispers in the crowd. No one told anyone else, but everyone understood. This wasn't a place for forgiveness. This was a place to remember that sometimes justice doesn't need to be reclaimed. but requires someone to admit to the guilt they silently bore. Monroe gave no speech. She posed for no photos, left no trace, but people saw her from afar, standing among the trees behind the wall. Her hands held no flowers, no microphone, just a single slip of paper, white, blank. She didn't post it, she only held it, as if her message wasn't meant to be written, but to be lived. Each day new notes appeared. Some were written with fountain pens, some in blood, just a few small words. One note read, "I once believed in him." Another flowed like a poem. One was blurred by rainwater, but none were removed. None were torn down. Even the cemetery janitors, each morning, paused to read a few lines before starting their work. From private shame, the wall became the foundation of a new awareness, that it's not just those in power who commit wrong. It is society itself, when it chooses to stand still, when it knows but says nothing, when it claps for convenience, when it turns away out of discomfort, that enables the collapse of moral order. And throughout that time, no one proposed turning it into a tourist site. There were no tours, no translations, no suggestions for a permanent exhibition, because they understood this was not a place to look. This was a place to bow one's head, not for the dead, but for the part of their conscience they once let die, without realizing it. As the apology notes began to yellow in the wind, and the steel wall at the military cemetery remained as cold as the first day, something else quietly spread across university lecture halls. Her name, not as a slogan, not on an honors board, certainly not taught as a hero. Dana Monroe entered the curriculum like a fracture, to let students feel the quake beneath the foundation they once thought unshakable. The National Strategic Officer Academy was the first to change. In the syllabus for leadership and political consequences, the 8th week's lecture carried a single title, not because she was a general, but because she didn't draw her weapon. The words were bolded, no exclamation mark, no footnote, just a title, but the lecture hall fell into silence the moment it appeared on the big screen. Some furrowed brows, some tilted heads, but no one looked away, because in those 43 characters lay not just a person's name, but a reckoning with an outdated model of power. The lecturer, a retired colonel, didn't recount a biography. He didn't start with medals or birth dates. He simply replayed a 12-second clip. Monroe standing before the auditorium, eyes fixed on a child, hands unmoving. No persuasion, no command, no defense. Only silence, and it was that silence that stopped a nationwide collapse. When the clip ended, he turned back and asked softly, "Why did she do nothing?" No one answered, because everyone knew it was precisely because she did nothing that history had to record that moment. A student stood up, without asking permission, and asked, "So, are we learning ethics to handle weapons, or to handle ourselves?" There was no answer. But from that day, the Academy shifted its training focus from situational response to ethical consequence comprehension, not because Dana Monroe was a legend, but because she was the final line the system reached before it fell. At the State University of Constitutional Order in New York, law students were required to participate in a reconstruction trial of Monroe, not to relive the verdict, but so each person could choose a role: juror, defender, witness, even a member of the public audience. Throughout the performance, no correct answers were allowed, only cross-questioning. One group decided not to build a courtroom on a stage, but in the open square, between 4 glass walls, so passers-by could look in. They read no scripts. They debated, argued, disagreed. Some cried, some walked out midway. But when the session ended, no one clapped. They stood still, as if they had been judged, not spectators. The Federal Strategic Policy Institute took a different route. In the newly issued curriculum, Monroe's name was not listed under national heroes, but under boundary case, when the system forces one individual to uphold morality for the collective. The phrasing sparked controversy. Many objected, arguing it diminished her. But that very pushback forced the institution to host a special 3-day forum titled Between silence and resistance, who bears the gap? When the media sought Monroe for an interview, a closing statement, she sent back only one handwritten line. "If I had to speak, I'd never have risen again from that funeral. No ornament, no oratory, just a refusal, stronger than any declaration ever read from a podium." Because Monroe understood, she didn't need to be taught as a great woman. She needed to be remembered as the reason future generations are forced to ask, why did a general have to face the full cowardice of a system alone? While her name quietly entered the syllabus, the opposing name, Hasker, was erased through action, not proclamation. During a policy theory seminar at Boston University, a group of seniors inserted a single slide into a presentation, projecting Hasker's image along with the words, "Not everything once taught deserves to say." The room fell silent. When the professor ignored it, the students stood up and left the hall in unison. That quiet act was captured by an observer, and the under 1-minute clip was shared millions of times with the hashtag #NotInOurSyllabus. At a military library in Chicago, the staff member in charge of archival materials refused to restore Hasker's mold-damaged manuscript after a roof leak. When questioned, she simply said, "Some things deserve to rot, just like the decay they were born from." That quote later became the tagline for an online campaign urging academic institutions to remove Hasker's work from required reading lists. More than 30 universities joined, not with proclamations, but by silently changing their syllabi. Her name wasn't printed on stamps, no street was named after her, but it appeared quietly, in lecture slides, in undergraduate theses, on system ethics diagrams during crisis modules. One communications student defended a thesis titled "Dana Monroe, the Structure of an Unrefusable Refusal." The paper featured no photo of her, no quote. It simply analyzed the gap between justice and social reaction, using her silence as the primary data. Conversely, at an annual Department of Justice conference, when organizers accidentally reused an old video clip in which Hasker spoke about the necessity of pressure and maintaining order, the segment didn't last 10 seconds before the audience interrupted with collective applause, not in approval, but to shut it down. One attendee stood up and asked bluntly, "If the system once allowed him to represent us, then maybe the system needs a new representative." No one objected, no one defended. The room went quiet, then shifted to a new topic without prompting. When an education system begins to write someone into its books, it's not because that person was perfect. It's because they woke up a part of the mind that society had allowed to fall asleep. Dana Monroe didn't enter the curriculum as a female hero. She entered as a silent beat, forcing the next generation to rewrite the rhythm. And that new rhythm, quiet but irreversible, is becoming the dominant melody in the next chapter of justice. She doesn't need to stand in a public square, doesn't need to give interviews, doesn't need to make grand declarations about inspiration, because even in silence, her name now has become a verb, an action, a way not to betray oneself in the moment others choose to bow. Without fanfare, no press conference, no mention in official news bulletins, yet on a Monday morning at the southern courtyard of the Federal Police Headquarters, where once hung a plaque engraved with the names of those who had served with honor and steadfastness, a silent void emerged between two gleaming bronze squares. The name Hasker L. Reynolds was no longer there. No one spoke, no one explained. Only a technician wiped the indentation of the former name with a velvet cloth, then stepped back to make way for the new inscription. Force is not authority, not a sentence, but a declaration, cold, resolute, and irreversible. From that moment, history did not erase his name. It simply refused to carry it forward. That very evening, an image of the quietly altered honor board was anonymously posted on Reddit by a maintenance worker, accompanied by the caption, "A clean void is better than a filthy honor." The post swiftly climbed the trending charts. People began revisiting every instance where Hasker had publicly spoken with a sanctimonious demeanor, then juxtaposed them with leaked clips from the trial. A slew of social media accounts that once praised him were suddenly labeled as cowardly fan pages, compelling their owners to delete posts, disable comments, or issue public apologies. But the public was unforgiving, not because they had erred, but because they had used that error to mask their fear. At a small cafe near Capitol Hill, a server brought coffee to an elderly man, tall, with graying hair, and quietly retracted the stirring spoon. When he inquired why, the server simply said, "Here, we don't provide utensils to those who once ordered beatings of minors just to meet quotas." The customer was Hasker's former media aide. No one confronted him, but the adjacent tables immediately emptied as if an invisible barrier had formed, not out of disgust, but because no one wished to share the air with a decaying legacy. Within the campus of a high-level security training school, students were assigned to write rebuttals to the philosophy of stability through fear, a model Hasker had once embedded into textbooks. A first-year student submitted a one-page essay with 4 lines. "I don't need to learn how to instill fear. I want to learn how to make others want to stand beside me, not beneath me. And if this system once taught the opposite, then it must relearn." The essay was initially shared internally, but within 3 hours, it had appeared on nearly 100 academic forums. No one knew the student's name, but everyone referred to the piece as the manifesto of a generation unwilling to bow. Meanwhile, inside the federal prison, Hasker was relocated, not for security reasons, but because 3 inmates filed requests not to share space with someone who once viewed the law as a whip. One of them was a former police officer who had been forced to leave the force years ago for refusing to arrest people to meet Hasker's quotas. In a confidential interview, he simply said, "Now I eat in silence, but at least I no longer have to breathe the same air as someone who thought power was a reason not to listen to anyone." Even his final official portrait, hung in the administrative records room of the National Policy Bureau, did not escape silent purging. A newly transferred young staff member discovered the frame hung upside down, glass shattered, face turned to the wall. When he asked his superior, he received only one response: "Leave it that way." And since then, whenever the void between the 2 gleaming bronze squares on the honor board is mentioned, people don't say, "His name was erased." They say, "That space is where we remember we were once wrong." No one corrects it. No one replaces it. No one polishes a new layer of bronze, because leaving it empty is the most profound engraving. We once placed the wrong person on a pedestal, but we took him down, not with hatred, but with an unforgivable severance. At the State Police Commendation Archives, a brief memorandum was dispatched to all departments. Revoke all medals, retrieve all recognitions, erase all references to Hasker from the honor system database. No explanations, no mention of ethical violations or reassessment of character, just a single line, no longer aligned with public value standards. Clerks executed the procedure without bowing, without sighing, as if this wasn't punishment but garbage disposal. A historical sanitarium. At the headquarters of an Eastern Police Academy, where a bust of Hasker once stood in the commemorative courtyard, people awoke one Saturday morning to find the statue gone. No one claimed responsibility, but its former spot was replaced with a bare concrete block, atop which sat a crudely inscribed tin plaque, "No longer represents us." A cadet recorded a clip, posting it with the caption, "This morning I passed by and saw honor return to silence." The clip garnered over 10 million views in less than 2 days. No background music, no effects, just an image of emptiness. But it evoked a purification more profound than destruction. And then, like a ripple effect needing no headlines, numerous official websites of councils, research institutes, and training centers that once mentioned his name quietly removed every photo, every biography, every quote once used as a symbol of regulation. No one spoke of it, but no one objected, because justice, once it speaks through silence, renders all justifications mere noise. At a seminar on law enforcement policy, when an elderly professor inadvertently cited Hasker as an example of a former symbol of civil control, the auditorium fell silent. No objections, no debates. But the silence was so heavy that he had to pause midway, adjust his glasses, then continue without mentioning that name again. After the seminar, a student tweeted, "When an entire classroom chooses not to react, that's when history speaks." Around that same time, an old documentary that once featured Hasker as the architect of modern law enforcement policy was permanently removed from a major streaming platform. Notably, the reason cited was not copyright, but clearly stated, content no longer reflects community standards. In various discussion groups, users circulated a spliced clip of him speaking about order being maintained with an iron hand, juxtaposed against the empty frame of a dismantled memorial site. No commentary was necessary. The past itself was now unraveling, the performance once orchestrated like a fabricated symphony. Even the final place that still retained remnants of his name, the federal prison where Hasker was serving time, could no longer remain indifferent to the cold wave of an awakened society. The public inbox of the facility received more than 10,000 emails, sent by veterans from every state. There was no chaotic outrage, no threats, only clear, succinct messages, no forgiveness. One wrote, "I once marched under the flag he waved. Now I burn that flag with my own hands, because it is no longer clean." Another said, "We do not hate. We simply refuse to be represented by a man who used power to trample on honor." A group of former Academy graduates even submitted a petition requesting the removal of Hasker's signature from their diplomas, proposing that new certificates be issued without any trace of his involvement. In their reply letter, the school board wrote only one short sentence, "We understand." There was no response from the prison. None was needed. This time, silence was no longer concealment. It was agreement. When Hasker's appeal was submitted to the Supreme Military Court, it was summarily rejected. No debate, no hearing scheduled. Beneath the Chief Justice's signature was a single line, as if a final sword stroke, severing the power play that had spanned multiple administrations. This sentence is not for an individual, but for a doctrine of governance by fear. From that moment on, no one discussed punishment, because what was condemned was not a person, it was a mechanism that had allowed a man to masquerade cowardice in the name of discipline. And now, that very mechanism had to wash its face by erasing every trace of the man it once praised. Just one day after the appeal was denied, a short article with no byline spread like wildfire across legal forums and social media. "We are not appealing the verdict. We are appealing the very belief that once made him trustworthy." That quote appeared on posters at law schools, was printed on T-shirts, and became a slogan at student discussions. No official movement backed it, but the momentum was so strong that a software company that had once invited Hasker as a brand ambassador was forced to pull all past advertising campaigns, not due to backlash, but because no one dared mention him as a role model for human governance through technology anymore. Financial records didn't lag. The decision to terminate all pension payouts, honorary allowances, and reintegration support was passed within 2 hours, with 0 votes against. The reason cited was not violation of regulations. It was a violation of the fundamental principle of public trust. No one defined what that principle meant, but no one needed to ask. Hasker's name was removed from the disbursement system with a simple line of code, a silent command that erased an illusion once upheld by public funds. When the official notice reached his cell, the officer folded the paper and placed it on Hasker's breakfast tray without a word. Hasker looked up, ready to react. But no one looked back. Even the guard who held the cell keys had begun referring to him as Inmate 739 instead of his name. Outside, on a national policy analysis podcast, a guest who was a former cabinet advisor stated bluntly, "If the system once wrote his name in gold ink, then today silence is engraving it in minus signs." That statement was immediately clipped and went viral on Twitter, overlaid with a blurred image of Hasker's face and bold red letters in the background. The only way to dismantle a false symbol is to stop calling him a symbol. At a military hospital where Hasker had once funded a rehabilitation unit for wounded soldiers, a group of young nurses proposed renaming the facility the Monroe Wing. Initially rejected, but just a few hours later, over 8,000 signatures from patients and their families forced the board of directors to convene an emergency meeting. The renaming was announced not through a press release, but by quietly mounting a new aluminum plaque on the wall. Soon after, someone recorded a clip of the original ribbon-cutting moment, Hasker standing stiffly with a forced smile, and overlaid it with footage of the new sign where his name no longer appeared. The clip lasted 19 seconds, had no dialogue, no effects, but it was enough to make the entire online community nod in agreement. There's no need to tear anything down. Just return the name to those who deserve it. From that point on, every act of removal no longer took the shape of rejection. It became a process of civilized purification, cold, precise, unspoken, yet deeply embedded in the layers of public memory. People began to realize that so-called cancellation was not the end of a character, but the beginning of a generation no longer willing to compromise with cruelty dressed in uniform. No one had to declare the end of the Hasker era, but from that moment forward, no one referred to him by his real name, only by his consequence. At the Federal Police Memorial Hall in Denver, where a large photograph of Hasker had once hung in the main corridor, visitors saw a blank space for the first time. No nameplate, no caption box. Just a patch of repainted wall, slightly off-color from the rest, like a scar that can't be hidden but no longer wants to be preserved. A high school student stood still for a long time before that blank space, then wrote in the guest book, "Sometimes silence is how justice exhales." 1 week later, someone quietly taped an A4 sheet to that wall, with bold print, "Once hung here, a face no longer worthy of being seen." The paper was removed within minutes, but the image had already spread online. Hundreds of copies later appeared at various law enforcement facilities, in meeting rooms, at public service counters, even outside the gate of a police academy. No one claimed responsibility. No one was investigated. Because no one wanted to protect a symbol once considered a command pillar, only to be revealed as a crack between honor and fear. Also in Denver, a group of journalism students made a short documentary about the erasure of Hasker's image. During filming, they sought out former staff who once served under him. A retired guard broke down in tears on camera, recounting how Hasker had ordered a teenage boy to be isolated for 48 hours, simply because he looked defiant. The guard spoke slowly, word by word. "I used to think I was protecting order, but I was shielding silence for wrongdoing." That quote was later isolated, set to somber background music, and went viral with over 5 million shares, not because of sentimentality, but because it was the first confession society had long awaited from inside the machine. At a photo exhibition on law enforcement history held in Texas, when the only image featuring Hasker appeared in the digital archive, a wave of attendees protested, demanding its removal. The curator explained it was archival, not honorary. But the next day, someone hacked the system and replaced all captions beneath the photo with red text. "Removed for not representing." The organizers were forced to shut down the entire display system, and in their press release, Hasker's name was no longer mentioned. That very attempt at neutrality reignited the question, why did the system that once glorified him take so long to finally fall silent? Inside the prison where Hasker was serving time, a group of inmates quietly moved their beds away from his block, not out of fear, but out of contempt. One evening, someone etched into the stone table where he usually sat the words, "A leader is not someone who instills fear, but someone others choose to follow." The carving was shallow and crude, but when guards came to inspect it, no one scrubbed it out, no one reported it. Only one inmate, from the same wing, was later transferred without explanation. But when a leaked video showed the transfer, capturing Hasker deliberately turning his face away as he walked past the inscription, one still frame was all the online community needed to understand. The most effective punishment sometimes does not come from the state, but from no one wanting to share space with a man once called powerful. Dana Monroe made no statement. She did not object, did not approve. She did not post. She did not appear, because she knew this was not a battle between two people. This was a self-reckoning of a system once deceived by its own manufactured image. Hasker's erasure did not bring her satisfaction, but it confirmed one truth, that collapse does not always come by gunfire, but by no one speaking his name anymore. From now on, when ethics and strategy and individual responses to collective power are taught, lessons will not begin with the name of the wrongdoer. They will begin with a void, for future generations to look into and understand. Some names once thundered like storms, only to vanish not because they were defeated, but because no one was willing to repeat them. A silent execution, and justice, in the end, needs only that. And that void is no longer confined to books, but has become a collective reflex. An academic seminar at the University of Southern California was interrupted when an elderly professor inadvertently referred to Hasker as a worthy model for crowd control. The entire lecture hall stood up at once. Not shouting, not arguing, just stood. That solid silence made it impossible for the professor to continue. The clip of the event was later titled "The Stand-Up Lesson," when history can no longer stay silent, garnering 3 million views within 48 hours. No narration, no analysis, just a room full of people rising together at the mention of a once celebrated name. At a police service appreciation ceremony, during the reading of senior commanders who had influenced the force over the past 2 decades, the announcer reached Hasker's name and hesitated. No one asked him to stop, but the hall sank into a dry silence. After a few seconds, the announcer said softly, "This name has been withdrawn," and moved on to the next, as though he had never existed. A live stream of that reaction spread rapidly across social media. It was shared, not for drama, but because its cold detachment felt like the final nail in the coffin of a once untouchable title. Inside his cell, Hasker received a book from the prison library. Upon opening it, the usual printed quote on the inside cover had been replaced by a crude handwritten line. "Your theory did not save you, and no one wants to read it anymore." No one confirmed who had written it. The prison staff took no disciplinary action. The book had all its pages violated no rules. But when Hasker tried to return it, no one accepted it back. From that day on, the library ceased lending out any materials he had authored, even though they were still kept as proof of a mistake, once hardbound. At a subway station in the capital, a billboard meant to display portraits of security heroes had been painted over with a simple graffiti. An empty square with bleeding red text below it. "Not everyone once displayed deserves to be displayed again." City officials initially tried to remove it, but after 3 attempts, each coat of new paint was defaced again. They quietly left it as is, a tacit admission that some lessons are best preserved in ugly ink, so no one repaints them in gold. A group of former police officers who had been promoted based on Hasker's tactical recommendations held a closed press conference, formally renouncing all prior academic associations. One line in their statement was repeated 3 times. No longer a model, no longer a man, no longer of value. No one interrupted them. No one challenged them, because in each of their eyes people did not see regret, but the release of a shackle worn too long under the guise of effectiveness. The video of that press conference was not widely broadcast, but circulated within internal law enforcement forums, an unspoken detoxification, without orders, yet universally understood as necessary. Hasker did not know these things were happening, but he felt them, because when his name disappeared from commendation boards, from textbooks, from training videos, and even from whispered conversations among old colleagues, that was no longer punishment. It was exclusion, not from the law, but from collective memory. A form of punishment requiring no courtroom, no verdict, no justification, just one silent decision. We will no longer speak of him. When his name vanished from every plaque, every document, every mouth that once defended him, people began to realize what remained was not victory, but a silence that needed to be filled with something indelible, something that did not belong to power, was not based on title, needed no medal, and that something won the steadfastness of a woman who stood still as the entire system shook and did not take a single step back. Since the verdict was delivered and his name withdrawn from the roll of honor, the way Hasker was treated changed coldly, without a new prosecution, without anyone lifting a hand. One day, after news of his revoked medals appeared in the court's brief announcement section, a veteran who had once been sidelined by Hasker during a military conference quietly returned a photo taken with him a decade ago. No letter enclosed, only a small handwritten note. "I never posed with trash." The image later spread on social media, becoming a popular mock wallpaper, with the caption overlaid, "Once a man, now a mistake." In the courtyard of the federal prison where he was serving time, other inmates, including those once sentenced under administrative decisions made during his tenure, began silently turning their backs whenever he walked by. No one hit him, no one insulted him, but that collective act of turning away made each of his steps crackle in the air. Just once, when he entered the dining hall, someone had dumped an entire shaker of salt into his meal. No one claimed responsibility, no investigation was made, and as he screamed, the entire room kept eating. Heads down, as if he were yelling in a graveyard no one cared to visit anymore. A group of law students who had reenacted the Monroe trial later launched a campaign titled "Erasing the Serpent's Trail," calling for the removal of every quote bearing Hasker's name from courses on doctrine and power strategy. They sent hundreds of emails to deans, professors, and curriculum boards. In a video capturing students' reactions as his photo was taken down from the main lecture hall, there was one short cheer, then silence. No laughter, because they were not celebrating a fall. They were witnessing the final crumbling of a man who once thought himself untouchable. At the annual memorial ceremony for federal security forces, where Hasker had once been an honored guest for 6 consecutive years. This year, the second chair, the one reserved for retired high-ranking commanders, left empty. No one sat. No one mentioned it. But on the nameplate, someone had quietly affixed a strip of black tape. After the ceremony, a freelance photographer captured the moment and posted it on Twitter with the caption, "Honor does not belong to those who once had a seat, but to those no longer deserving of one." The image was instantly shared millions of times, becoming one of the wordless symbolic moments of severance that needed no proclamation. Dana Monroe did not respond to any reporters, did not step onto any stage, did not agree to appear in any documentaries proposed. She left behind only a letter, not long, not sent through any organization, not signed ceremonially. It was printed in a single copy, folded, and placed in a plain white envelope with no recipient's name. But on the outside, written in a gentle yet resolute hand, "For those who will continue living." The letter began with a single sentence, a sharp slash across the habit of building monuments to forget the truth. "I do not wish to become a symbol, because symbols are often used to erase facts." A sentence with no rallying cry, no elaboration. But from that moment forward, every leadership ethics syllabus was forced to re-examine its purpose. Were they honoring someone, or were they concealing something? At a prestigious military academy that once used Hasker's speeches as strategic case studies, the lecturer entered with a blank board. No slides, no documents, carrying only a printout of Monroe's letter. He read each line aloud, without inflection, without pause. When he read the first sentence, a cadet seated mid-row abruptly stood, tore out a notebook labeled "Crisis Control Strategy," Hasker, and threw it straight into the trash. An act not encouraged, yet not stopped, because everyone understood some things must be discarded, not for flawed content, but for corrupted essence. In the days that followed, at various research institutes, numerous scholars who had previously cited Hasker's power models began submitting withdrawal letters, requesting the removal of acknowledgments they once called academic pillars. A major academic journal was forced to cancel an entire special issue titled "Postmodern Strategic Legacy" because 3 of its featured studies were based on his ethical argument. The chief editor resigned, leaving behind a single sentence at the press conference. "We once believed he was the mind of the system, but it turns out He was only the rationale of cowardice. At the same time, a group of young veterans began a graffiti campaign across subway stations surrounding the Federal Administrative District, not with tributes to Monroe, but with symbols of silence, a sealed mouth, a lone figure standing among empty chairs. Beneath each image, just one line: "She did not step back." These images quickly spread on social media, but most striking was one painted directly over the iron door that once bore Hasker's name at the old police headquarters, now an abandoned administrative site. A soldier walking by stopped, took a photo, and quietly posted it with the caption, "I used to serve under him." She never mentioned herself, never mentioned victory, never recounted the trial, never spoke the name that had been erased. Instead, she wrote about one image no one had noticed, but no one could forget. That afternoon, amid a row of soldiers saluting in formation, stood a 12-year-old girl, daughter of a fallen serviceman, silent, her left hand raised to her forehead, her right hand trembling uncontrollably. No one told her to salute. No one asked her to be there, but she stood there, alone, solemn and shaking, as if her father's loss had transmuted into something greater, a silent vow to the country, bypassing the government. Monroe wrote, "I do not remember the eyes of the adults that day, but I remember that girl. And if anything kept me standing without drawing my weapon, it was that image." In a society drowned by declarations and symbol wars, the sincerity of those words was like pure metal, cold, heavy, unbreakable, and There was no tribute ending, no call to arms. The letter closed with one short line, without flourish. "If one day you find yourselves at gunpoint, remember, I did not step back, not to challenge, but to remind. To remind that the choice not to retreat does not belong to the powerful, but to those brave enough to remain upright in moments when the whole world deems bowing down as wise." That letter, once delivered to the Federal Strategic Archives Center, was later proposed by a former cadet to be engraved, not on stone, not in a museum, but on the main gate of the Pentagon. The proposal faced fierce opposition for weeks, but no one could find a valid reason to reject it. In the end, the board ruled the full letter would not be engraved. Only one line, placed below the central slogan of the Department of Defense: "Neither bow down nor press others down." Beneath it, in small letters, carved like an echo, "If one day you find yourselves at gunpoint, remember, I did not step back." There was no plaque ceremony, no cameras. Only young soldiers passed by each day, pausing for a few seconds, reading and moving on. Not because they did not understand, but because they knew to understand something like that often requires an entire lifetime of keeping one's back straight. The words carved into stone do not echo loudly, but the silence around them resounds forever. And sometimes it is that very sound, not shrill, not boastful, that forces those who once thought themselves untouchable to live under the unending echo of contempt. 1 week after the inscription was carved onto the main gate of the Pentagon, the photograph of Hasker that had hung in the reception corridor for former commanders was found to have been replaced without any official order. No one could identify who did it, but when security discovered it, the new image had already been fastened with 4 steel bolts. It was not a photo of Monroe, nor was it any other image of honor. It was simply a pure white board, with a line written in red ink by hand: "No one remembers those who knelt before fear, only those who stood still when it mattered." Below that, someone had taped a small handwritten note in pencil: "Not everyone is forgotten. Some are erased." When Hasker was escorted out for morning exercise, he had to pass through the hallway where other inmates had drawn mocking symbols on the wall with charcoal, his face distorted, framed like a wanted poster, with a sarcastic caption: "Charge, cowardice, with a weapon." The warden ordered it to be erased, but no one dared to do it, simply because everyone knew scrubbing those markings would not erase what he had left behind. It would only make people remember more. At a closed meeting of the National Security Strategy Council, where Hasker had been a speaker for over 10 years, A young aide proposed the removal of all his references from the internal archive. An elderly general objected, attempting to justify it by saying, "We should preserve them to compare past strategies." The aide said nothing, but the next day, all copies were returned to storage under the label "Materials that Distort Ethical Standard." No announcement was made, but the entire council understood. When trust is fractured, no theory can patch it back together. A 38-second video clip was uploaded online over the weekend, showing a group of high school students visiting the Pentagon. As they passed the gate bearing Monroe's inscription, one girl stopped and read it aloud. The person filming captured the moment. A middle-aged man, later identified as the officer who once served as Hasker's secretary, walked by and immediately turned his face away. The student watched him, then turned to her friend and said clearly, "That man probably remembers, but he doesn't dare stop." That line instantly became a viral audio on TikTok, with millions using it as a soundtrack to expose cowardice in many fields. In the comments, one veteran wrote, "We don't need anyone to bleed for justice anymore. We just need enough people brave enough to name cowardice for what it is." And so, when all the noise fades, when the debates end, when the photographs, the documents, the once powerful faces have all fallen from the walls of honor, what remains is a single line. No chest thumping, no name dropping, no promises. Just a reminder, there was once a person who did not step back, and that stillness, that unwavering stance, became the starting point from which a generation would know where to begin. Not because she was protected, but because she never had to hide. We know that every one of you who listened until the very end carries your own story. Perhaps an unspoken grievance, a wound once dismissed, or simply a moment in your life when you chose to stand still instead of bow. Leave a comment. Tell us how you felt, what you once faced, and what kept you from falling. Every shared line not only helps us understand you better, but also becomes a light for someone else, still fumbling in the dark. Hit like if you believe this story deserves to be heard. Share this video with those you believe need a reminder that silence can be power, and that one person standing upright can shift an entire system. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we have more reason, more motivation to keep telling you stories that truly matter. Stories not everyone dares to hear, but everyone needs to hear. We do this, not for fame, but because we believe too many truths are being drowned out by things that are easier to swallow. And if you feel the same, then you are part of the reason we do not step back.